This is Audiogyan, and I am your host, Kedar Nimkar. Welcome to a deep dive into the minds of luminaries from the Indian creative world. Today's guest has been dealing with conflicts for quite some time now. I'm pleased to have Avni Sethi with us on Audiogyan. Avni is an interdisciplinary practitioner with her primary concern lying between culture, memory, space, and the body. She conceptualized and designed the Conflictorium, about which we'll be deep diving as a case study. Her interest lies in exploring the relationship between intimate audience and the performing body. So thank you, Avni, for giving your time, and it's a real pleasure to have you on Audiogyan.
Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. So typically I have three formats. One is regular interview, one is a case study, and one is a biography. In case study, I generally try and go deep into one problem statement or one solution or one project. And I thought Conflictorium. I know we spoke offline, and you have spoken a lot about Conflictorium. So I'm going to take a little philosophical take on my questions, and obviously just try and document in our conversation what Conflictorium is and how did it come to be in the periphery, but mainly wanted to pick your brain as to what is conflict. And I wanted to start off with this, that what does conflict mean to you? Where do conflicts come from? Or from my experience, I've done a 10-day course on Vipassana, and seems to be that conflict is inherent. So I wanted to just maybe you can start by saying what does conflict mean to you? Is there a good conflict, and so on?
Yeah, actually, it's a great place to start, because there is a tendency to think that conflict is undesirable. But I often want to think of conflict as a sign of actually being alive, as being a robust, dynamic mind and body in the world, which is at odds with status quos of all kinds. And therefore, the question of good conflict, bad conflict, meaning I'd rather receive conflict as a reality of life, and therefore not really apply value judgment to it. But I do think that what we may be actually conflating in most cases is conflict and violence. And while conflict is very often, at least in our parts of the world, is civilizational question very often. It's a question of how do we see the world, what informs our world, what historicities have shaped our minds, what privileges have marked our positions, and often based on these mostly choiceless identities that we inhabit, we seem to be in conflict. Now, whether that conflict needs to translate itself as violence, I'm not sure at all, actually. I don't see the need for those two to have this kind of relationship. But unfortunately, as much as conflict seems to be inherent in us, violence is also becoming a habit in us. And I think that's how those two become conflated with each other, and then it becomes problematic.
But I mean, the violence is a manifestation of the conflict, or is it because of certain other criteria?
Well,
I mean,
I think conflict is, I think violence is a choice. There is, at any given point in a conflict, we have a choice to dialogue it, to transform it, or to use violence within it. So I'm uncomfortable to ascribe any metaphysical or subconscious position to violence. Um, Violence is an absolute conscious choice that people make under any circumstance. Now, if it's a subconscious choice, then there's a question of whether it's justified or not, because that's what societies do. They justify certain kinds of violence and sort of call out certain kinds of violence as good or bad. So we tend to say that if violence is for the purpose of self-preservation, then it's justified. Or we also say that, oh, if the state uses violence, then it's justified. I wonder who gave that kind of authority to the state, that moral authority to the state to use violence. But anyway, that's a condition in which violence is justified in the world. Not that I'm saying it's okay, but it's justified to some. So there is. I want to actually separate in our thinking mind these two ideas, which seem to have such a deep relationship. But I think I'm saying they don't have to have that. They don't have to have that umbilical cord attached to them.
But maybe then we can like just go deeper here, that how does this conflict also arrive, or how do we acknowledge it? Because if it's inherent, or it just, I mean, yeah, it's like a core uh thing to ask is, where do these come from?
Well, if I move
And sorry, and sorry, if I want to just extend that further, is that, are these traditionally or typically together, as in like as a collective, or is it an individual one as well?
I mean, if we had to just really ground that conversation and say, let's look at South Asia, and for a moment, let's look at India and the kind of deep-seated conflict that Indian society has been harboring. There is a a structural kind of violence that is inbuilt into our society via the system of caste. And by having this system in place, one is actually keeping a certain power equation in place. Now, anybody who challenges that power equation or wants to actually issue conflict, saying this power structure is not acceptable to me because it does not include me, it does not acknowledge my humanity, it does not acknowledge my dignity, seemingly a conflict is born. Every attempt then to keep the initial power structure in place, every tool, every structure, every bureaucracy, every aesthetic, every ritual is then used to keep that power structure in place. Now, every time there is a status quo and someone wants to challenge that status quo, a conflict is born. But the hope is that when that power structure is challenged, and this challenging takes time, so it doesn't happen in one lifetime, and we know this about even India. It happens over many lifetimes. But when status quos get challenged, some transformation within society happens. And therefore, conflict is a essential part of society's evolution. That if society has to evolve, there will be a conflict within it for it to emerge as a transformed society.
But sorry, I had a sequence of questions, but now this gives me a segue to one more. Is that then, like, there, as I mentioned, is it a collective, or is it like it's sprinkled or it exists within individuals, and then there is media or some sort of state or some sort of narrative which is coming in the from the subconscious to the conscious, and then it takes that transformation, or it need not be championed by someone.
Well, I think the sense of conflict exists within individuals also, within a single individual as well, right? Whether I want to be this or whether I want to be that, between identities, between choices that we may make, between roads that we may travel. So, of course, the experience of conflict is extremely personal, but it perpetuates itself within the public sphere, within large groups, within communities. And I say this particularly because today, if we have to think of conflict, we have to think of identities. How did our identities get shaped? What is the historicity of our identities? What kind of privileges are attached? And therefore, what is the sort of dire need of keeping intact that privilege? At what cost does that privilege need to be kept intact? And what is the extent that people are ready to go to keep that privilege intact? So the moment the question of safeguarding community honor, all of these kinds of ideas are concerned, it becomes a collective project. Conflict becomes a collective movement. Likewise, when it is about reclaiming and asserting the dignity of a collective identity, then communities come together, people come together to claim that, and that's the only way it happens, right?
Yeah, it's so beautiful. I don't know whether what I'm saying is making sense, but there is this word which we say that when you said safeguarding, you are sort of conserving or confining it. And it's I don't know, it's ironic because then even those societies are called conservative, right? It's there's a paradox there because you're trying to safeguard something, and because of that you are also not liberal. Is it making sense?
Well, I wouldn't go towards the liberal just as yet, but I do think that this obsessive impulse to conserve for time to not take its turn, I think there is certainly where conservatism comes from. So there is a relationship between what is conservative and how much is being conserved. I feel like to think of that as status quoist grounds it even further in a political scenario where nothing must change.
Got it. So I'll change tracks a bit and maybe ask you on more on the practical front of it, where you are sort of a designer, performer, artist, and if we narrow down this conflict as a concept to a particular individual, like what according to you is there a relationship between a performer and the audience? Because again, when the performer or an artist is what is he or she trying to do, according to me, is expressing some inherent conflict which he or she sees in the world. So do you see, or have you pondered upon this thought, that what happens exactly between a performer and an audience? Because recently I interviewed Srijan Deshpande, and he quoted someone saying that art is half truth, where you present and then leave it to the audience to interpret the other half. So I found that very fascinating, and I thought I'll ask you that, because at Conflictorium you're dealing with both sides. You have any thoughts around that? What goes around when a performer is expressing?
The thing about making art is that we make art exactly in the way we live. We see exactly in the way we eat, or we make art as per our own freedoms. If I have so much freedom, I make so much art. If I only have so much freedom, I make so much art. Uh, um, but but therefore, what I'm trying to say by this question of attaching this question of living with art making is that we possibly can't live a particular kind of life and then make um, art that responds to the universal. We live particular lives and we make particular art, and that's the bottom line. So if we live lives that are ridden with conflict, or that don't have the choice to actually live without conflict, what are we going to make art about? We're going to make art about things that are difficult, that need to be questioned, that are ridden with conflict, because that's what lives are. But if lives are easy, if they come with easy access to land and water, um, then the art that will be made will see a world which has abundant land and water. Um, so then here is the question, that if artists and audience who don't have the same reality come together in a contract of spectatorship, then what happens? Because it's not necessary that those who are making and those who are experience what has been made have common ground. Unfortunately, more and more we see that those are the kind of silos in which art is made and shown. But in an ideal case scenario, that shouldn't be true. Then what do we have in common to access work or access a piece of art? I think for performance, and because I wear multiple hats and I put my performance hat on, I think a basic unit of sharing space or sharing anything within a performance space is breath. Breath becomes the basic unit of exchange. And I know this to be true as a lived experience as a performer, but there are also sort of practices like Kudiyatam that use this understanding, where if I am as a actor or an actress or a dancer using a particular breath, if I'm using the breath of fear, then you as my audience will start breathing the breath of fear with me. That if I am breathing sort of the veer ras, then you will also breathe it with me. And it is really my ability to influence your breath as a performer is really where the performance begins.
Beautiful.
Yeah. So what is the relationship then between audience and performer, or for that matter, artist and viewer, spectator? I mean, there's a tendency to think that if the audience is not there, the art doesn't happen or it doesn't become. I'm not sure. I'm not sure of that. I think artists make irrespective of their audiences. But to be seen in the world is what we all want.
Correct.
To be seen, to be heard. And if there is nobody making us feel that, then what do we do with what we make?
Have there been, or at what tipping point does it becomes an active participatory kind of a entity in bringing transformation? Are there certain milestones, because it happens over and over again, right? So are there tipping points, or people are just making art for art's sake and then there is or a detective art and stuff, and then uh, it 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 culminates into some sort of, it interferes with politics, it interferes with other stuff.
Um, honestly, I do not know of any art that is apolitical. Even art that wants to do art for art's sake is not apolitical. That then is the politics of that art, that it chooses to be quiet when the world is burning. That is its politics then. So there cannot be any art that is apolitical. Let's get that out of the picture. So when if we begin there, then there is the question of choice. And do I make work and hope for the world to see it, and make whatever it wants to make of it? Or do I make work because I have something to say to the world, and the world is influenced by what I say? Now, as an artist, now it feels like it's too much burden to put on the back of a single artist. But what is it? What is the human condition? There's a scholar called Ellen DeSenaike who made a proposition that, if whatever we have not needed in the process of evolution, we have left behind. So we didn't need the tail anymore. So we don't have the tail anymore. If we didn't need art, if it was not essential to our beings, we would have left it behind. But we haven't. So it's absolutely essential to our being. It's how we see and frame the world. We try very hard not to claim that kind of position for it. We really try very hard to tell it that, it is a luxury, it is a question of leisure, it is a position that comes after roti, kapda, makan, shiksha, not before. I often say it comes simultaneously. It should come simultaneously. But we build as many frameworks for art for it to remain confined to kind of occupy limited power in society. That way, then the status quo is maintained, because art can build like incredible holes into status quos.
I may not point to the right reference here, but somewhere I had heard or read was about even art as, मतलब हमारे चार वेद है, तो पांचवा was the Natya Shastra kind of a thing. I'm not using the right words here, but there was because it was democratic, it was to be accompanied and not really go in some place and watch art, but it was part of life.
Just on that note, the Natya Shastra is an incredibly sexist and casteist text. It deems who will become untouchable if they do what. It claims that as a woman, if I have round breasts, I can only act as one character. If I don't, then I can't act as the other. So for a text that is revered in this country, as a text of great virtue where a lot of learning comes from. The flip side of it is it's a text that has never believed in equality of any. So if we have to assess at this point classical art or classical dance that takes heavily or is informed heavily from the aesthetics of the Natya Shastra, is it going through a quiet crisis in this country? Is it being able to make and sustain an interest and sustain its relevance within our society? It's asking some deep questions at the moment that will never be asked in public fora. It is suffering a great sort of an internal kind of churning, saying, what are we doing here?
Yeah. Something to introspect. And you nicely put it that in the current time, because a lot has to do with time in general, which seems very invisible, but it's constantly running. So there would be certain context and there would be certain situational things where things were written, and like as you mentioned, nobody's challenging or nobody's is questioning as we move ahead in the time, which is also cyclical. So yeah, many threads open there. So what, like, I understand a little bit of where you're coming from. So what is Conflictorium? And like we'll talk about roti kapda, makan and shiksha also. But if you want to like give us like a quick flavor, I'll keep adding show notes, links to people can just do their research. But in a nutshell, like what is Conflictorium and what are you trying to investigate? Is there even a framework to investigate conflict?
So the Conflictorium started out as a museum of conflict in Ahmedabad. We opened in 2013. So actually, it's we are having this conversation at the onset or at us finishing 10 years
Awesome.
of the museum. But really, I think it was attempting to do two things. One is, as you rightly put it, to investigate conflict and to really be able to say, where do I begin to investigate the question of conflict? And unlike how the world wants us to read, the world wants us to read history, it wants us to read politics, it wants us to take a position, but we may not be able to do it till the time we investigate the self. Therefore, who am I? Where did I come from? And because of where I come from, what becomes available or what gets taken away from me? If I understand that, I may be able to begin to actually question how these structures are settled. Now, whether it is a question of caste or gender or religion, labor, any of these questions, if processed through the lens of the self, as first interrogating the self, then so within the interrogation of the self may lie an interrogation of conflict. So anything at the Conflictorium, any installation, any exhibit, any artifact, rarely ever points to something outside. It mostly builds frameworks such that we can read ourselves and put it out there for us to read, for our own selves to read, and then we'll get somewhere. So the Conflictorium, in a sense, is a series of experiential participatory exhibitions that moves from the personal to the social to the political. It has permanent exhibits and temporary exhibits, and it does then a whole bunch of performances or conversations. We also have a reading room, partly because we think that we can't learn ourselves without reading. And that plays a really important role in what kind of people we may become. So so it's essentially attempting a methodology that can inform the self, that can also critique the self, and we'll hopefully arrive at conflict through that route.
But sorry, I'm like taking a tangent here. When you deeply investigate yourself, doesn't it sort of take a spiritual path? Because then it's very tough to stay in the worldly conflicts. You know what I mean?
Yep.
Yeah. So you sort of pause or
so meaning who is spirituality available to? Spirituality is available to those who have a full stomach. Now we want to today say in 2022, we want to think of Kabir as a mystic poet. We don't want to think of him as a anti-caste theorist, because the mystic Kabir absolves us from a difficult truth while reading very, very kind of poetry which is very pointed. But the moment we position him as a mystic poet, we can feel good about reading Kabir. It's soothing. But the moment we read him as an anti-caste poet, then it's not all feel good. Then it's a very deep critique of who I am and where I come from. So the path of spirituality in this case depends how we arrived at it. If we arrived at it as a mechanism of self-preservation, then its purpose is different. If we arrived at it as through a certain kind of annihilation, then maybe there is something there to talk about.
Interesting. So does it mean that when we read Kabir as a mystic, now even that concept or that thought or that narrative is coming into a collective consciousness through some elites, and that's what we are absorbing? Or I mean, does this conflict typically happen top down, or it's bottom up? Even I'm sort of struggling to frame the question correctly, but I think we are building a common vocabulary here, so maybe you can.
Yeah, but that has always been the act of the elite, because the upper caste or the upper class, what is it that they have made? What is it? The upper castes have always rided the labor of those that they have oppressed. So it is not surprising at all that the upper caste would co-opt Kabir to be a poet that speaks to them. It's not surprising. It's happened so with so many forms of art. Meaning, I feel like Nritya Pillai, as a Bharatanatyam dancer from the Isai Velalar community, speaks with so much clarity about her history and her family's history, and where Bharatanatyam belongs, and where it has, in whose arms and laps it has landed in. And I think more and um, more Bahujan people are standing up and claiming their legacies, claiming their art, claiming and once those claims are done, once those reparations begin to happen, that then the question will have to be asked: what is left? What will be left for a
The
Brahminical
upper class.
society to say that this is a labor? Because art requires labor also. It requires time and it requires hands. Isn't that the classic sort of um, uh, every work that needed hands to be done was relegated to the oppressed classes? Everything that seemingly needed the mind was uh, was in fact laziness was reserved for the upper castes. So we land up on some fairly shaky ground of some metaphysical ideas and nothing left in our hands, you know. um, ask the upper caste masses of our country to be able to grow some apples or to grow some wheat or rice, and then we'll see whether anything will come out of there. Possible.
Hmm, hmm,
I
hmm,
think it works
hmm.
similarly with art practice.
Got it. So, yeah, I mean, how do you, like, as you mentioned that you know about yourself and that's where you start investigating. Uh, can you give any example just to help illustrate as to a particular, maybe the memory tree that was there is there at Conflictorium, or any other example which will help understand that how are you trying to, I don't know, for a lack of a better word, make it relatable to a potential audience.
Mm. So what you're talking about is the sorry tree, which actually
Yeah.
comes towards the end of your tour in the museum. Um, it's uh, it's an invitation for audiences to think of this question of the apology, um, and what does the apology really mean? And it's interesting because the note that goes along the tree doesn't mark out um, what you need to apologize for, why you need to apologize. There's no directive there at all. But
Hmm.
very often the kind of conversations that uh, happen there, I mean, of course, there's a range, and within that range, there are some who feel some kind of catharsis in that space, but there are also some people who feel very angry, because
Hmm.
it feels like they are being nudged or pushed to apologize for something that they didn't do. Um, and a conversation ensues after that, um, because anger needs to come out like then and there. Um, and and one has to almost remind them, saying whatever it is that you're angry about is inside of you. There's nothing in this entire building that's telling you that you must apologize to someone specific or to something
Hmm.
specific. It is part of your internal landscape that is beginning to feel uncomfortable or is beginning to experience uh, is beginning to see uh, reality not tainted for a moment, for an hour, for 40 minutes, um, to somehow see it outside of your social construct.
Hmm.
Or say, for example, mm, you know, the the conflict timeline, which is the first exhibit when you enter the museum. There's something which is basically a timeline starting 1960, which is when the state of Gujarat was formed. And there's a tendency in Gujarat to think of Gujarat state as a largely peaceful state. Except, and we speak about it so casually, like, except for an aberration, which is 2002, it was an aberration, which is not true though. It wasn't an aberration. The very existence of the state of Gujarat in 1960 came from a linguistic conflict with Marathi-speaking Bombay presidency. So there was a linguistic conflict. And meaning the kind of caste-based violence that Gujarat has seen, the kind of religion-based violence that Gujarat has seen before 2002 and continuously after 2002 is mind-boggling. But to walk into a room and to say, the perception that has been offered to me very neatly, very systematically, such that I become the ignorant person that I am today. There is a structure in place that keeps me ignorant. It's not simply just my individual ignorance. There is a whole political, media, familial structure at place that keeps my ignorance intact. If anything, within the museum, I think we try to somehow expose that structure that's keeping this intact.
Interesting. I must come and visit it, because I was just going to ask you that, are there any nuances that you can share? Because typically, again, people are very uncomfortable with ambiguity generally, or we sort of work in binaries, right? Either I'm with you or I'm not with you. There is, and this happens with me typically, because if I take the current government stand in whatever WhatsApp groups or something, then people assume that yes, you are pro, and if I counter, then okay, you are anti, right? So there are these binaries. There's nothing in between. Have you made any conscious effort to show these shades of gray and make them more sensitive or aware, or just juxtaposing two things and leaving it to the viewer?
Honestly, I do not think conflict has two sides, first of all. And therefore, this binary is a false binary that is being produced.
It's being produced is what you're claiming.
Yeah, Bidi, I do not see two sides. I see one large mess. But to produce binaries is actually, it's a strategic move. I don't think it is not inherent in how the world is. Even something like gender, we can take clue from there. We have been told for millennia that gender is binary, that there is one male and there's one female. To think that all along that narrative worked in someone's favor and we had to believe it. Today, if we say that gender is a spectrum, you may be 20% something, 80% something else. But violence will occur at the sake of just acknowledging that this is a spectrum and this is not a binary. It's a falsely produced binary. And so we see it in something that is so fundamental as gender, then we obviously see it in our electoral politics. I mean, they use it. Everybody in electoral politics uses this. If you are not with me, you're with them. So at the Conflictorium, I think this question of binary doesn't arise. There is no question of binary. It is quite, there are no two sides.
Yeah, when I say two sides, is that there's something happened because of some some circumstances, I would say, or certain narratives maybe. And now I don't know, it's maybe it's like too much of conditioning of uh, being in binary is where I'm coming from. That's why there is this. Do you neutralize it? So we'll anyways conclude with one last question. I mean, I'm sure one must come and visit the place to really experience it. Um, and again, the point where I started was I did Vipassana, and one of the Buddha saying is that peace is generally an outcome if you can stay with the conflict, if you can stay with that momentarily conflict. And while Conflictorium engages in dialogue and like a lot of talking, right? You be comfortable with what your history is, what your present is. So how do you see the future of it? Like, will peace manifest? And I'm sure it's cyclical, so things will change again. But what sort of in the corporate world वो mission vision रहता ना वैसा is peace possible, is or are you even looking for a peace because you don't have binaries? Then yeah, I mean, what's the future like?
Well, an ideal future is where we will not need the conflictorium.
Hmm. Hmm.
That's a ideal case scenario. But peace is not viable without justice, and that is a long road, and it's a difficult road to walk on. So, of course, there's uncomfortable peace that is maintained in our worlds. Meaning Buddha's peace is in a transformative world, in a transformed world, which means how do we arrive at social transformation without justice? We can't. Then it's a whitewash. So maybe justice is the future, and peace in the farther afterlives.
Got it. Yeah, I think lot of food for thought here, and lot of what I can say is that I think actually one should just be with that conflict and visit the space to understand what's brewing there. I was saying, like, I mean, there's lots of food for thought here, and lots of there are no, as Conflictorium also I'm hoping that strives for, is that there are no solutions. You'll figure out, you'll move along, you'll adjust and adapt and figure out the way for the future. But I think it would be best to come and visit and have a much longer conversation in person. But thanks a lot for giving your time. It was great to have you, and it was, as I said, lot of things to ponder upon.
Thank you for actually opening this space up. And maybe an hour is just about scratching a surface, but I hope everybody who's listening in also somehow finds their way to the Conflictorium, either in Ahmedabad or in Raipur, Chhattisgarh. Either one.
Okay. Great. Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
And that's it from today's Gyan session. For show notes and more Gyan, visit audiogyan.com. And if you wish to connect with me, I am at Audiogyan Moments on Instagram. Until then, take care.